So I am doing this project about modern day segregation, as you can see. This subject is so interesting and so sad to me because I think it often goes overlooked. We think about segregation as this thing that was over with the civil rights movement and it was way back in the 60s, but the fact of the matter is that it still exists today and not as much has changed as we would like to believe. So I thought it was really important to go into this subject and just consider, as Americans, what state our country is in at this point. So in order to understand this history that we're kind of stuck in, we need to understand the history itself. So after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, about 6 million African Americans fled the South to go to parts of the country where they thought they could have better economic opportunity and also flee racial terror. Because not many of them had educations, they'd been deprived of education and high skill work opportunity for centuries. A lot of them went to cities with a lot of low skill jobs readily available, like Detroit or Chicago, where a lot of manufacturing jobs were available. Now, when these 6 million African Americans fled into the cities, there became a housing shortage, and a lot of them were housed in public housing along with whites. But the whites weren't very happy that African Americans were moving into their towns. So in 1935, a man named Harold Ikes, who was the housing director for FDR, instituted a rule called the Neighborhood Composition Rule, which basically stated that you couldn't interrupt or mess with the pre-existing racial composition of a neighborhood. And so this basically instituted segregation within public housing. Then after the housing shortage, this government started subsidizing white families to move to the suburbs, and the phenomenon of white flight occurred to get out of the inner city. But this is where it gets kind of sticky, because while the government provided this opportunity to white families, of course they didn't give the same opportunities to black families. So what ended up happening was something called redlining. Basically, if you came from the red shaded neighborhoods, you were much less likely to get a loan, or you were specifically denied a loan for coming from a red neighborhood. But if you came from a green neighborhood, you were fine to get a loan. And I bet you can guess what the primary deciding factor of what those neighborhoods were shaded are. Yeah, it's the predominant racial category in that neighborhood. So essentially, if you were black, you were not going to get a loan to move into a white neighborhood. And if you were white, you would get a loan to move. And this really instituted the groundwork for separating people based on white and black residentially. Now, in 1968, there was a victory, and the Fair Housing Act was put in place. This basically stated that you couldn't discriminate in housing or in housing loans based on the color of someone's skin color. And of course, this was a good thing. However, you'll remember this map, which basically limited white people to wherever they wanted to go, and black people to the red and yellow areas predominantly. Well, this meant that the federal and local funds were mainly poured into areas with predominantly white people. So what ended up happening is that after the Fair Housing Act was instituted, black people by law could move into those predominantly white areas, but because the housing values had gone up so much in those areas, they weren't allowed, or they couldn't afford to move into those areas. This unfair allotment of resources resulted in a severe income disparity that we can still see the impact of today. These dashed lines right here show areas of Dallas in which the median family income is less than 80% of the average area income. So you can see that basically all of South Dallas, which is predominantly Hispanic and Black, is really feeling the effects of that income disparity. And the gray part here shows areas of Dallas that are more than 50% minority population. So as you can see, Dallas is very segregated. Almost all of South Dallas is predominantly minority population, and almost all of North Dallas is white. So lastly, I'll leave you with this quote by the great Martin Luther King. And just with the reminder that you can't live in community with somebody if you're across the highway or across the river from them. You have to live on the same street as them and the same schools as them. Thank you for listening to my presentation.